Now I'd like to call up the next panel, and Mike, as you're coming up here, and Dave and Tom's here, and Richard. Mike Giari is going to be the moderator for our panel on civil works and planning. For those of you who don't know Mike is a past president of the Bay Planning Coalition. You got to come over here, Mike. As well as the executive officer, executive director of the Port of Redwood City. And the Port of Redwood City works closely with the Corps. Is that an understatement? Based on the emails, they work really closely with the Corps. And they have clearly being able to dredge to the depth they need for moving goods in and out of their port and the impacts that has in the Silicon Valley and the south part of the bay. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mike. You have about 1 hour with everybody, so okay, it's yours. And if you have questions, give us a card. I'll take them for this panel.
Thanks, John. I'll stand up so we can project. I can project a little bit better here. And raise your hand in the back if you can't hear me. Joe's brief presentation is a great introduction to what this next panel is going to talk about. And that's that thing that the big planning bugaboo, the planning long that he was talking about. What is the Corps' planning process, and how long does it take, and could it be changed, and could it be improved, and could it be shortened? So our first two speakers in the panel today are from the Corps of Engineers, and they'll explain what this planning process is from start to finish, right prior to the start of construction. And then our third panelist from the Port of Oakland, after we hear how it's supposed to work, will hopefully tell us how it really worked, at least in the case of the Port of Oakland. So I think that will also be very helpful, very informative, and provide us some insight into the Corps' planning process. So our first panelist is Tom Kendall. Tom's I don't have a bio for any of the speakers today, but I do know Tom. He's been with the Corps of Engineers in the San Francisco district for a number of years, and we've worked with him on planning projects at the Port of Redwood City. So Tom will start with a description of, how does this planning process start, and how does it get started, and the steps that are numerous that it has to go through in order to complete the first chunk of planning. So Tom?
Yeah, so it's almost going to seem like I'm the naysayer after Joe got up and said, here's all the cool stuff we want to try to do, because I'm going to just sort of walk you through where we are now and really what a change is going to be. Am I loud enough? Louder, okay. One of the things that we meant to get to you all, and I guess it's going to get sent out electronically to anybody who registered, is a planning process transformation frequently asked questions flyer. And I believe, back to Joe's comment about what's out there on the public, I think if you Google planning smart, which is different than planning long, but we'll see, I think you can get to our webpage where all this stuff is found. But anyhow, we wanted to make sure that you at least had this one, because actually, in large part, this was written for the field, because, i.e. us practitioners, because we're all still trying to figure out really what a lot of these philosophical statements really mean when it comes to trying to execute what we're doing. So, so anyhow, planning process transformation, frequently asked questions. What will transformation civil works planning process accomplish? What is the current situation with the planning paradigm, etc.? Is anyone frustrated with the current planning process? All questions that are asked on this little sheet that you will get electronically. So, I also, not a formal panelist, but when I knew we were going to be, or I was being asked to talk a little bit to environmental processes and the whole transformation, I did ask Deanie Kennedy to join us. Dr. Kennedy is our South Pacific Division environmental senior person, and she has been rolling up her sleeves a little bit on this same topic. So if the questions get too deep on how you do an EIS in a 3-inch binder, I'll defer to Deanie. But anyhow, let me click through these slides. You're the controller? Okay, so what I'm going to start off with is the real basic phases we go through. The focus of my talk is going to be the upper right-hand quadrant there, the feasibility. But it starts with a reconnaissance. If you click the slide, what happens? Then we get some scope of a study effort that we'll enter into a partnership with a non-federal entity on. Then we go into this phase that's supposed to last 2 to 3 years. These durations have been around for a long time, and it's few and far between those who've actually had the wonderful experience of being able to actually adhere to those. But anyhow, these aren't new numbers in terms of duration. There's just a renewed resolve to try to actually embrace that challenge and get within those durations. So anyhow, what's supposed to happen in those few years? We work in a 50-50 partnership with a non-federal sponsor to produce feasibility reports. We go through something called independent external peer review, IEPR, where we actually have somebody totally external to the Corps reviewing all of our decision documents and environmental work. We go through Washington level review. We have a board up there called the Civil Works Review Board that has to bless anything we do. And then we ultimately produce a report called the Chief of Engineers Report. That allows us to get in the queue for a congressional authorization to construct. While we're in that queue, we can go into what's called a design agreement and do some of the more refined designs, so that ideally, when we come to this corner here, where we now have a construction authority, we already are ready to sign an agreement and start constructing. And then there's details here about that, which I will not get into. Okay, so next slide. What I want to do is kind of a, I don't know, what's like the game Concentration as a kid, where you turn over the card and try to see what's under it, and this or the reveal, we might call it. Anyhow, I wanted to kind of show how the process was relatively quick at one time. I think you were sharing about the getting that permit really quick way back when. Well, there was a time when, in theory, our process was relatively quick, and then things happened. And I will reveal the things that happened as we go through these slides. So anyhow, we always had this final little stop here that could add 1 to 2 months for getting that chief's report reviewed, and then several months of going through a process with what was called the Board of Engineers for Rivers and Harbors. So we always had something akin to that in our process. But let's go to the next slide. Then we had the 70s, and now we've got NEPA. So we've got to produce an environmental impact statement or something akin to that. We have public processes associated with that, scoping meetings and various reviews with the products that have to go out, and time for the public to react, and agencies that started to form. Okay, next. Then we added, in the 80s, we added cost sharing during feasibility. Now we couldn't just start spending federal dollars to study stuff. We had to have partners who could agree on the scopes and the costs and be willing to bring their share and identify their financing, timing, and all that. That added quite a bit of time here as well. So now we've got negotiations associated with getting into your cost sharing agreements. And I think that's about the extent of what we added with this reveal. Okay, next. Was there something else I should? Anyhow, and see, what do we got now? Okay, well, we seem to have jumped to today. So anyhow, suffice it to say, there's a lot of stuff. We ended up with the independent external peer review was new with WRDA 07. There was several intermediate milestones that got introduced, and each one of those milestones, there was agency technical review being done. Stuff had to leave the district where the work was being produced and go somewhere else in the country for a review team to look at it. So there was quite a bit of review associated with each milestone. And actually, a little something that happened here, we changed the Board of Rivers and Harbors. It actually went away for a little bit because we had sponsors complaining that that was a big bottleneck. Well, it's back. Now it's called the Civil Works Review Board. Anyhow, all these processes have added time, and so let's go to the next slide. So legislatively, things that came to us via, like NEPA, the stuff that came in the Water Resource Development Act of 07, that all added somewhere in the order of 14 to 24 months of processing. And then the Corps, just adding our own internal checks and balances and value engineering, you name it, that's at least another 10 to 21 months of stuff. Nothing to do with production. This is just getting other people to like what you've done. Anyhow, bottom line, there's a whole lot of time here, and you contrast that with saying we're going to do it in 3 years, and, well, there's the frustration. Anyhow, that's where we are, and now I'll try to talk about where we're trying to get to, but I just want to really set the stage here. It's not going to be easy. So what do we got going here? Okay, so this is now focusing on trying to expedite things in that first slide's upper right-hand quadrant, the feasibility process. So we have 6 steps we go through, and typically we would have a couple different internal milestones along the way, one called a feasibility scoping meeting and one called an alternative formulation briefing. But basically you start off identifying your problems and opportunities, your objectives, and then you go through an inventory and forecast of conditions. This is really your future without project conditions. If we do nothing, what's that landscape look like? A new development, relatively speaking, is climate change, sea level, stuff like that. We have a whole other part of our organization looking at those kinds of issues and saying, you know, we can't even say there's a singular future anymore, even though that's kind of the way NEPA has tended to take us. We really are supposed to do scenario analyses for multiple scenarios what sea level might do. So anyhow, even some of these early steps have forks in them. But in theory, you come up with a future without project condition. You come up with an array of plans that would attempt to change that future in a favorable way to produce the benefits you want. You all agree that those are the alternatives to be studied. You go through and evaluate how well they perform, contrast, compare, select, and so on. Let's go to the next slide, or the next part of this one. Yeah, so historically, we've referred to this 6-step planning process as the beehive, because the beehive has these little arrows on it that shows how at any point in this process you might get new information, you might iterate back. And as planners, we've been encouraged to embrace the iterations. Well, what they're trying to do, you know, as everybody wrestles with this, how can you do it faster, quicker, cheaper stuff, is try to minimize the iterations, try to make successive decisions and have a philosophy all the way up to our Washington headquarters that we're going to try to lock in some of these decisions and be really adverse to iterating back. It's got to be a really good reason if you're going to backtrack. So the process needs to be decision focused, always making the next decision, always scoping the decision after that. It's got to be risk informed. If you make a decision based on imperfect information, and it's always imperfect, but you know, what are going to be the risks of that decision being wrong? Is it really catastrophic? Could you still get a reasonable project authority? Remember, this process is geared towards getting a project authority. It's not your final design. Every last little factor of safety doesn't have to be captured here, but you want to make a reasonable recommendation for what should be authorized to be constructed. And there's lots of opportunities to refine that subsequent to that actual authorization. So keeping that in mind, what is an appropriate risk-informed approach to some of the decisions that have to be made during this phase? So we have to manage the uncertainty and the budgets and schedules intentionally. Okay, so that's some of the philosophy and how are we going to actually make this work. Let's see what my next slide has. Okay, so here's that 3x stuff. It is what it is. What is going to be particularly challenging, you know, again, the milestone system we currently have doesn't really lend itself to this. So one of the first steps, and I'll show a slide on in a minute, is to redefine those milestones. Have fewer of them, have better vertical engagement back to Washington early in the process, things like that. So the idea here is to, oh, okay, SMART. I actually wrote this out because I can never remember what SMART stands for. SMART means, anybody want to guess?
Specific, measurable.
That's part of it. I think we changed it up a little bit, but it does start with specific and measurable. What's A? Attainable, same idea, yeah. But for us, R is risk informed. I don't know if that was in the original SMART. And then the T is timely. So that's the philosophical statement going out with this initiative. the challenge, and Joe alluded to it a little bit, is, can we actually have studies coming to us that are sufficiently far along in terms of sponsor alignment, agency alignment, etc., that we have a prayer of actually accomplishing this. There's another whole philosophy that's been put out over the years, which is that we want to be part of comprehensive planning. We want to take holistic, watershed-based looks at things. We want to help our sponsors go through that kind of a planning process. Well, the challenge is, how do you do that and at the same time say you're going to get to turning dirt or a decision in 3 years at least, so that you can turn dirt soon. Frankly, they're a little bit at odds, but I think there is some possibility of a merger there, where we basically say, here's the tree, here's all the different pieces of fruit that could be pursued at some point, produce some sort of programmatic document on that, and then say, and here's the low-hanging fruit. And that low-hanging fruit that conceivably actually we could get to a decision on what construction authority comes with that in short order. It does raise additional questions then, though, and this is where I'll defer to Dr. Kennedy, as to how do we really package that message to those who are reading our NEPA documents, because we have to be very careful not to look like we're piecemealing. We have to say that first piece of fruit we grab, it's fully informed by how we plan to address the rest of the tree. So there is some messaging challenges there, anyhow, let me go to the next slide. So this is the milestones sort of envisioned for this. We're saying we're going to just have a couple milestones, because less is better, right? And one of the things that's not listed here but is very important is a charrette. And the charrette, depending on where your study's at, we'll do the charrette now. It's not going to have to be at the beginning of things if you're already underway. But if you were starting fresh, and in fact, Mike's project, Redwood City Harbor Deepening, we're going to try to have a charrette next month. That's the first one we've done. So I'm speaking out of total ignorance on, I haven't actually lived a charrette yet myself, so bear that in mind. We'll talk after October. But anyhow, so what we'd like to do is ideally actually say we've accomplished our first milestone, combine the charrette process with this. But the charrette process is where you bring together people from regional centers of expertise within the Corps, our national headquarters, our division office, and the district team producing the product, and as well as resource agencies and stakeholders, ideally, and you brainstorm. You talk about, what is it we really want out of this? If we were to build project X, would that actually be the 60% solution? It's those kind of discussions, and then you allow the charrette process to inform really what work will go into your alternatives analysis. So it's intended to get us to an answer relatively quickly, and then we go out to the public for our NEPA review, our independent external peer review, which is still with us. We haven't gotten rid of that one. That was given to us by Congress. But we would go out before we've actually done the feasibility level design. So the thinking here, if we can really pull it off, is that we would defer the feasibility level engineering work to after we've made a decision. So it seems a little at risk of being backwards, but the idea is you've done risk-informed processes up to this point, and you've pretty well windowed down the singular tentatively selected plan that merits that additional analysis. So you're trying to push off as much analysis as you can, so that it's only being applied to a single alternative and not a larger array. Anyhow, and then we get a chief's report and so on. I won't belabor this, but we're focusing on decision making early in the study process, using progressive and iterative planning processes to address key areas of uncertainty. So that's kind of some of the literature that's coming out now. Again, we haven't actually gone through this yet. There's been a couple charrettes across the country. I've been talking to some of the folk involved with those, and it sounds like, if nothing else, we'll see how successful we are with all of this, but the SHREP process has already, I think, been very valuable from the information I'm getting. That it really does help get that vertical buy-in and identify efficiencies. So, next slide. Okay, I was also asked to talk briefly about NEPA, and again, this is why I got Deanie Kennedy here. But you know, yes, we have to answer to a lot of agencies out there, and this is one of the bigger challenges with this 3x3 stuff, because you know, we can say as the Corps we're going to try to do all kinds of efficient things, but if we go out with that EIS and we haven't done that feasibility level engineering work that answers a lot of questions that a resource agency might have, we're going to get sent back to the drawing board. So it's a challenge. But again, a lot of our audience is not just Corps bureaucracy. It's a lot of resource agencies who are charged with taking care of a lot of important species. So in any event, what we do for our EIS basically parallels what many of you are used to for CEQA documents within the state. And there's another parallel I wanted to point out real quick. Next slide. And that is that a lot of the basic steps you go through for NEPA are very similar to the basic steps we go through in our feasibility planning process. So we've done some of these. Eris likes to talk about how the study he did on Guadalupe River back in the 80s actually did this, but we've kind of gotten away from the idea of integrated documents. We're going to be trying to go back to those more. So integrated referring to your feasibility and your EIS being all integrated into one document. So anyhow, again, you're all going to get these slides. I won't speak to the details of them, but suffice it to say there is a parallel process here at work when we're speaking to our resource agency friends and our NEPA processes, and when we're producing documents for, actually it still says NEPA CEQA, doesn't it? Yeah, but yeah, over in the far right, that little header does say feasibility report. And P&G is a reference to principles and guidelines. That's a very, I don't know if you can read that back there, but you know, this is pretty well laid out in something that we got from the Water Resources Council back in the 80s, and it's been in the process of being updated, the principles and guidelines. This is another area where how the Corps is going to be asked to do its planning is being informed. I will spare you the details on that, but suffice it to say, it is a work in progress. The principles and guidelines that really are supposed to speak to our processes are still not final. Okay, is there any more slides? Okay, we'll just quickly, you know, yeah, we got to talk to a lot of folk. We don't make these decisions in a vacuum, and I think that's probably all I'm going to say on that, because I should let other people talk. I guess we're not actually taking questions now. We're carding later. Speaks. Okay, thank you. Yeah, these are backup slides. Sorry, we're going to have to blast through those.
Thank you, Tom. That was a very, very comprehensive view of the feasibility study, the planning process, and where it is and where it's going with the new 3x3x3, which the Port of Redwood City is anxious to get involved with as our deepening feasibility study is about. Well, I don't know if it's halfway or not. After Tom's presentation, I'm not sure where it is. So
we'll talk.
So hopefully we've finished the feasibility study phase of planning a core project and gotten maybe through the environmental review, the NEPA CEQA process. But we're not done yet, right? Right, Dave? Okay, so we're not done yet. Dave will touch on some of those aspects of the planning process, but there's more steps to come, and before we can deepen the channel or drive some sheet piles or whatever it is that the core project involves. So David Doak, who again has lots of experience with the Corps of Engineers and comes from the Corps of Engineers San Francisco District, is our next speaker. And because I didn't read my program before coming up here, I didn't know everybody's bio was in the program, so I'm not going to read them. You can read them, okay? But David will continue us through the planning process.
That's fine. As Mike stated, I work with Tom, but I'm on the engineering side of the house. And although my focus is engineering, I've been involved with a lot of projects that started at the recon phase, all from the planning phase, and have seen them all the way through to construction. So what I was going to talk about is the whole set of phases that you might see in a civil works project, depending on whether it's a navigation project or a flood risk management or an ecosystem restoration. They all follow the same general list of things that have to be done before we can break ground on your project. So as Tom mentioned, we start with a recon phase, and this is a very brief phase that starts with typically a letter from you as a potential project sponsor to us, the Corps, at the district level, and it would be addressed to our district commander, and it would state what you would like us to help you with, building a navigation project or a flood risk management project, and you would briefly describe what it is, where it is, what are the benefits associated with it, and we would take it under consideration and put it in a queue of potential projects that would eventually be funded by Congress. And it's to start this effort, it's a relative pittance. It's a mere $100,000 to get things going, and that would be federal funding that comes back to us, the district that you approached, and we would do a determination of federal interest. And what this is we look at your project and we determine if it fits any of our major missions, whether it's navigation, flood risk management, ecosystem restoration. And then we would look at what benefits does your project provide or would provide in the future if it was constructed. And that is basically the federal interest. So if your project provides benefits either on a local level through flood protection, or maybe national benefits associated with commerce, then those bode well for you in your attempt to get some funding to get your project started. So at that point, once we take your letter, then it's on you to approach your congressional representatives and essentially convince them that this is a worthy project for them to invest in. Once you have an idea that you're going to get some federal support in terms of funding, you would come back to us and say, hey, I think this is going to fly this year in the budget. So we would gear up and put a team together to do this minimal effort, and the outcome of this effort is what we call a 905B report. This report identifies your project, location, benefits, congressional representation, all the benefits that would be realized, and it goes back to our headquarters office. And they review it to make sure that it fits within our mission statement. It's going to meet all of our policies. And then at that point, they tell us that we have accepted your report and we approve this project to proceed to the next phase, which would be the feasibility phase. At that point, you as a sponsor and the district that you came to would sign what we call a feasibility cost share agreement. And this lays out all of the things that will be accomplished in the feasibility study and how it will be paid for in terms of cost share. So once we have a feasibility study agreement, at that point, we are free to receive funds, federal funds, and your sponsor funds on a yearly basis, or however often you are able to secure funding with your congressional representation. And we would begin that study process. Actually, I'll come back to that slide later. But in the feasibility phase, Tom's already laid out the major steps that need to happen in terms of all your environmental permits. What else has to happen is we would do a preliminary design for whatever function your project is going to accomplish, whether it's flood risk management or navigation project. We also do all of the things that are going to help support the design. So if it's a navigation project, we're going to need some information on the type of soil that we're going to be dredging. We're going to need to know where that sediment's going to go after it's been dredged, so we need to look at all the places that you have identified or the project team has identified as potential placement sites for that dredge material. We also need to do some other studies, such as in the navigation program we would do a ship simulation study. And what this is, if you have a large harbor whereby the ships that call on your port are so large that they need assistance from the bar pilots, it's very important that the bar pilots buy into any project design that we would put forward. So we have a facility in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that has a very elaborate ship simulation unit. So what will happen there is we will send the bar pilots back there. The folks in Vicksburg will come out here and film the entire project as if they were aboard a ship. They would typically call at your port, and they would take that footage back to the ship simulation study and load that entire footage into a computer simulator, along with all of the approximate effects associated with wind wave action, storms, tides, anything you can think of that a ship might encounter on its way to transiting to your port. The pilots sit at a console that simulates the ships that call on your port, and I've been told that it's amazing how accurate it portrays that process of moving a ship into a port. So once you have the bar pilot's concurrence on the design, now you've got them as a proponent for your project. Then you move on to the determining what the cost to build that project is going to be. And this is just what we call a current working estimate, but it allows us to determine the cost of the project such that we can compare it with all of the benefits that creating that project will generate. And those benefits are measured in dollars, obviously. They would be in terms of, for a navigation project, in terms of how much cargo moves through your port regionally and across the country. Once we have identified, well, as Tom stated, once we have all that information in our feasibility report and you've got all your environmental documentation, at some point you're going to, I liken this process to standing in line at DMV. You take your feasibility report and your EIS and EIR and you stand in line for project authorization to go to construction. And what that involves is your project is going to be reviewed for compliance with all the environmental restrictions and regulations, core policy as far as design, whether it fits into our core missions. And at some point you will be given authorization by the district engineer, or the chief of engineers, who's the chief of corp, or the military boss for the Corps of Engineers. He will put out what's called the chief's report that describes your entire project and the cost, and a brief schedule of how long it would take to construct if it was optimally funded. And that report is submitted to Congress. And Congress will look at that report and determine whether and mainly how they're going to fund it in the future. If everything is correct, it's not a big deal to get your project authorized to start construction. What that means is you take your project and your permits and you go stand in the next line at the national DMV. You are now standing in a line of other projects across the entire country that have the same documents in their hand. And you are now going to compete with them for a fixed amount of tax funding that's going to support the construction of your project. So the document that you provide, the feasibility report and all the environmental support documents, is so critical to not only getting your project approved for construction, but that your project is so good in terms of benefits that it generates that you might get to move towards the front of that line for funding. So it's a real gross measure of where you are in relation to other projects, the BCR, the benefit cost ratio. There are some unspoken thresholds for where a project needs to be before it be seriously considered for funding in the future. So for navigation projects, that threshold is typically above 3 to be realistically competitive with everything else in the country. For flood risk management projects, I don't really have a good feel for that, but it's probably around 2.5. If your project is sitting between Unity or 1 and 2.5, you're going to have a long wait, probably, especially in light of the way we are progressing towards how we're going to build projects into the future. If the idea currently is to reduce the number of projects we would fund in a year so that we could concentrate on completing those projects as soon as possible. If you were standing in a line where you typically wait 4 or 5 years before you might see your first funding, now you're likely to be waiting in that same line 10 years or more, depending on how good your BCR is. So let's say that you have a killer project and you got to move up to the front of the line for funding. After you have received notice that your project is going to appear in a budget bill, now you can start making some serious preparations to complete your project. At that point, your project team that you put together for the feasibility report is going to move into what we call the PED phase, or the pre-construction engineering phase. This is where you're going to finish up your preliminary design and make it a final design. You're going to provide all the support documentation for that design. You're also going to, at some point, do what we call a value engineering study on your project. And this is intended to put fresh eyes on your project, to look at it in terms of breaking your project up into specific elements that are function specific. So what you want to look at is, are you spending money for a function that provides little benefit or a function that provides a lot of benefit? So it's a measure of, are you putting your money in the right place in your project in terms of design and construction? And you may have some features in your project that you as the sponsor want because you told your constituents or the people who provided your resources that you would give them a project that had these specific features. And regardless of what they cost, you told those folks that that project would have it. So in some cases, it may not matter what you spent on it to get that function. You're going to do it anyway, and that's fine. But the other the other elements that were broken down into function, you want to make sure that you're maximizing the value of the dollar that you put into that function. And maybe in addition to that, after looking at that function, maybe there is another way to do it less expensively or maybe even better for the same dollar. So those things we look for in a value engineering study. And those get taken back to you as a sponsor to evaluate, and you tell us which ones are worth pursuing and which ones you just want to abandon. But either way, all that information gets incorporated into the final design. And we get a much more defined cost for construction as well, once we have determined exactly what we're going to build for you. At the very end, we are developing the final plans and specs that will go to out for solicitation and construction in the future after you have secured the funding to start construction. Next. Now, before you can actually start construction, we have you sign what we call a project partnership agreement. It used to be called a PCA, or project cooperation agreement. But we have determined that by changing it to this, we can save hundreds of dollars. So once we have that agreement, now this agreement has to go all the way through our headquarters office to be approved, and will ultimately be signed by the Assistant Secretary to the Army. And it's a major milestone, such that we typically have, we make a big event about it with the project sponsors. So we would assemble at the project site, have a big ceremony, strike a coin, whatever. And that essentially starts the clock for the construction of your project. And we do some other things to make sure that we're getting good value for our dollar in terms of how are we going to contract to do the construction. And there's many types of construction contracts that we could employ to build your project. We are mandated to make good use of small business. So you may, when you get involved with us, you may get frustrated at some point because there are a lot of specific things that are different about small business compared with open competition with large contractors. That it makes it sometimes a little more problematic. Sometimes you might perceive it to be a little more expensive to go that route. But this is mandated by the Corps that we do this. In any event, we still seek to acquire contractors that are skilled, are anxious to see a successful project, and since I've been involved with the Corps, we've had access to several outstanding contractors over the years. So I have no qualms about enlisting the contracting community to build our projects. They're very skilled, and they care about your project as much as you do once they get involved. The other thing we have to have before we get started, if your project requires some real estate to build it, we require that you access or have access to that real estate before we break ground. So that may involve a notice 2 or 3 years before we think we might be going to construction, because we have no idea how long it may take you to get that real estate, whether you already have it in your cash or it's something that you've been saving for and you're waiting for us to say go get it before you actually go purchase it. Once we have those things in place, now we can start awarding construction contracts. And we do that as often as we receive funding in any year, or however many years that it's going to take to build your project. So as I stated before, when your project is competing against a nation's worth of similar projects, it's hard to predict how much you might be getting in any one year or when you're going to get it. So what we try to do is we will progress your project such that if we have to take a break for whatever reason, we don't lose anything by stopping at some point. And in some cases, you may be even able to realize some of the benefits that supported your project in just the small pieces that we complete construction on. One of the things that is alarming to our sponsors is that although in our feasibility report we identify a schedule for construction under optimal conditions, meaning we get fed money as fast as we can spend it and build, it doesn't happen like that in reality. Unfortunately, congressional reps have to satisfy their constituents all over the country, and it's hard for them to give up funds to support another project that's not in their district or their area. So the project may drag out much longer than you anticipated, and you will see a steady increase in project cost associated with inflation and escalation, if for no other reason. And where in the beginning you thought you were only going to invest in a $100 million project, when that project is done, you may be well over that, to the point where you may have to go take drastic measures to acquire additional resources to complete your project. And in those cases, we had to pause the project not because it didn't get federal funding, but because you as the sponsor were having difficulty providing your funds to complement the federal funds. If we are fortunate enough to complete your project to your satisfaction, we now enter the what we call the operations, maintenance, repair, and replacement phase. This is how we maintain your project after it's completed. So one of the deliverables we provide to you as the sponsor is a maintenance manual for how to take care of your project. And typically for navigation projects, you have it fairly easy because the maintenance of your project is on the federal government. It's on us to provide the funding and to maintain it as part of our mission to provide safe navigable waters. But if you are a flood risk management project, it's on you to maintain your channel or your flood control project, whatever it needs, so that it still meets the requirements of your project in order to pass whatever flood design you designed it to. Now, if you had to contribute lands, or what we call LERs, lands, easements, rights of way, relocations to the project, if the cost of those LERs was equal to 10% of the cost to construct the project, then you're done with your contribution, including up to the 35% that you might have to contribute typically to the construction. If, on the other hand, you didn't have any real estate to contribute, over the next 30 years after the completion of the construction project, you would have to contribute another 10% of the final cost of construction. That's your final bill. And you have up to 30 years to pay for it, but you can pay it off anytime you want. Included in the OMRR phase is, in some projects, we'll have an adaptive management monitoring phase. That's typically for ecosystem restoration projects or wetlands restoration projects. That is a requirement that typically comes from the resource agencies. And they want to make sure that that all of the things that you said you were going to do in your feasibility report, in your EIS, gets accomplished, such that at some point it's going to reach equilibrium and can maintain itself in perpetuity. That basically is everything that goes into typical civil works projects. So it's, as you can see, it's pretty easy. It's not complicated. And there are many other things that I didn't touch on that are out there to assist you in completion of your project. And those are having to do with potential funding sources, or how you might be, if you're a well-off sponsor, you have resources that would allow you to start any of those phases anytime you want, because you can afford to wait for us to catch up with the funding. We have some agreements in place that allow you to do that, to get ahead of the federal spending, and then maybe you get credit during construction or in some other form. But there are ways that we can assist you in your project to help you get it done faster and cheaper as well. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we got there. We got the project approved for construction and completed construction. And as David said, it's quite a process. So our next panelist, Richard Sinkoff, who's Director of Environmental Programs and Planning for the Port of Oakland, will tell us a little bit about Oakland's experience going through those many, many, many steps. I don't think they skipped any. And with their deepening project. And right now, I imagine, the Port of Oakland's in the operations, maintenance, and repair phase. And I'm sure they're learning some lessons from that phase as well. So Richard Sinkoff will give us some insights into that.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. That's perfect. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And thanks to Tom and David for the detail. As you know, the Port of Oakland considers the Port to be one of our most important partners and stakeholders in the Port's dredging program. My presentation will be, I'll take a different approach, a little bit of a different format. As some of you know, I'm also an officer of the Bay Planning Coalition. I'm privileged to serve on the coalition, and one of the things we've been trying to do in service to our members in our workshops and in our decision makers conference is also to sort of practice what we're all trying to preach here, which is efficiency and getting everything to a single point, the main point. So I only have one slide, and what I'm going to cover in my presentation are really some very, very basic high-level points. We also have in the audience here many people who worked on the minus 50-foot project. Len Cardoza, as many of you know, was our dredging project manager at the Port of Oakland. Deeply, deeply involved. I'm indebted to him for a lot of the detail that I have. Steve Lowe is here, currently an engineer at the Port of Oakland, working on our dredging program. I saw Jay, I don't know if he's still in the audience, but we had other former Port of Oakland staff people here. So there are many experts in the room who touched this project, worked heavily on this project. And when we get into Q&A, if there are questions that you have, I may call on one of my colleagues to answer that as well. What I'd like to do first is just set the context. And really the big context is the Port of Oakland itself and our economic impact, both in Northern California and nationally. As many of you know, Port of Oakland is the 5th largest seaport in the United States. We're one of the most important export gateways on the West Coast. We're one of the system of gateway ports, moving all of those goods out of California and out of the West Coast to principal markets in Asia. And many of you know that President Obama has a major export initiative underway in the United States. This is really to help with those budgetary problems that we've been talking about. Exports are one of the drivers of economic growth. And the Port of Oakland, I'm pleased to report, we're now exceeding exports over imports. And that means that California farmers, California manufacturers, and also manufacturers throughout the United States are able to find markets in Asia, in China principally, for goods manufactured and grown here. So the role of ports in the United States in our economy cannot be overstated. We estimate at the Port of Oakland, based upon our 2010 Economic Impacts Report, that in Northern California alone, over 73,000 jobs are either directly or indirectly associated with port activity. If you look at the United States, we are talking about over 800,000 jobs related to port activity, and that equals about $1.5 billion in wages from 37,000 direct jobs. So ports really play a major role in jobs creation and supporting businesses, not only here in our Northern California region, but really across the United States. I think in our study, we couldn't really show one congressional district that didn't have a link to the Port of Oakland. So I want to emphasize that. For those of you also not familiar with the port, we do also manage Oakland International Airport, and 20% of our airport is jurisdictional wetlands. So we work very, very closely with the Corps' regulatory staff on growing the aviation side of the house and also maintaining all the infrastructure out there in a very, very complex regulatory environment. We've had some wonderful partnering going on this year on our runway safety area program, which is an FAA mandated program to construct buffer areas around all of the runways to provide for safety in the event of any kind of landing or takeoff that might exceed the runway. So this is something going on around the United States. You can imagine how complex that is in an airport environment in which 20% of the land is actually under federal jurisdiction. And I can talk to you a little bit about that later. Okay, so now you have a sense of sort of how the Port of Oakland fits into the economy, our importance for wages. Let me just state one basic thing about dredging. We consider dredging to be the backbone of the maritime activity. So when you look at a port, what you see generally are the terminal facilities. For those of you coming over to Oakland, you'll of course notice on the landscape our beautiful cranes, the largest cranes in the United States. You'll see our terminals. But really what supports all of that are the federal channels. And so maintaining those channels for the Port of Oakland is really key to maintaining all of that activity. And I think we can say for all the other ports in the Bay Area, maintaining our navigational channels, and then of course on the local side, the berths, is really a key to keeping all of this maritime activity going. And maritime activity, as you know, is not just limited to the cargo ports. We're also talking about the oil ports, the refineries, the break bulk ports. We have a very varied port industry in our Northern California region, going from Redwood City all the way to Stockton and Sacramento. So having a unified approach to dredging and the disposal of dredge material is really key, and that's probably one of the key findings. In terms of planning, obviously Tom and David spoke about a very, very comprehensive planning process. I'm just going to highlight one thing that actually, again, I owe to Len as a key pointer. You saw how long that planning process could take. Obviously, we are very, very interested as the local sponsor in shortening that planning process. And one of the keys that Len has pointed out to me and to our team was the importance of using Section 203 of the Water Resources Development Act as a way of shortening that feasibility study process. We actually were able to cut off 4 years from what we estimated would have been around a 10-year process by using Section 203. So that was key. So Len can talk about that perhaps in the question and answer phase. Let me just describe a little bit what went into construction. What did this project involve? The project involved several pieces. We expanded the Inner Harbor Turning Basin in Oakland from 12,000 to 15,000 feet. We also had to demolish wharves, concrete buildings, and warehouse bays. We removed over 15,000 piles. We did excavation, dredging, and bulkhead construction. For those of you who were around at the time that we did this work, there was also a parallel process going on landside. This was the point of time where we decommissioned the Naval Supply Center in Oakland, that was also known as the Fleet Industrial Supply Center, Oakland. That piece of land, which was a little bit over, close to about 600 acres, had a reversion. The Port of Oakland was able to redevelop that project into the Vision 2000 Maritime Development Program. So concurrent with our minus 50-foot dredging project, we also built 2 major mega terminals, a new intermodal rail yard. We built an extensive system of new roadways, and we also did something very innovative at the time. We built a 38-acre public park at the center of the maritime area, and also built a 180-acre shallow water habitat, which is still under construction. This is part of the minus 50-foot dredging project, and was the major area where we were able to beneficially reuse all of that dredge material. So you can imagine the flurry of activity that was going on at the Port of Oakland, you know, in its construction heyday, which was sort of mid-90s all the way to the middle of the start of this century. Okay, what were some of the major findings in terms of the post-construction phase, documentation, and communication? Again, very, very high level. In terms of post-construction, we're actually, in a way, still in post-construction because we're still working on the Middle Harbor enhancement area. So one of the key areas that we at the Port of Oakland are looking for constantly is how to shorten that mitigation tail. And this is important from an organizational perspective, often internally, because frequently the business development side of the house, which will be our maritime division, is now focused on tenant relationship issues. They're focused on new business development and can sort of forget the fact that we still have a project to complete. In fact, we had an announcement that the 50-foot project was done. When was that, Steve? It was 2 years ago, right? A big ceremony. But the reality is the mitigation part of it is still ongoing. So we are looking for ways to obviously complete the Middle Harbor enhancement area. It's a very valuable resource ecologically for the Bay Area, but we need to find ways to shorten that particular window. In terms of project documentation, we needed to do a better job during the project process in documenting decisions. I've talked to Steve and to Amy, and one of the things I've talked about is now that we're going through an audit process, it's very, very hard at times to reconstruct all of the decisions in order to clarify where the monies went and how to get properly reimbursed. So documentation is absolutely key. I would say that communication protocols really are a component of documentation. This all fits into project management. Len has emphasized to me, as well as to others, the importance of stakeholder involvement. I don't think this can be, again, overstated. When we think of stakeholder involvement in these kinds of projects, we often think about the regulatory and resource agencies, but you also need to do outreach, particularly as a local project sponsor. At the political congressional level, you need to develop coalitions. I think here in the Bay Area, We need to develop a coalition regionally with our sister ports and other affected agencies that are trying to pursue dredging. And then finally, it's very, very important, even though you might miss this, for a federal project to develop a constituency with your fence line communities. We did that in Oakland, primarily with West Oakland through the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park project, and also with the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area. The community members were key in getting the support for this project and have a greater interest than we might often think in these kinds of projects. Let's go to some high-level recommendations that we'd like to make. I want to emphasize the need for being cost-effective. Many of you may not know, but the Port of Oakland has actually right-scaled itself over the last couple of years. We used to be an organization of over 780 employees at the Port of Oakland. We're now about 480. What that means is we've had to learn as an agency, as the Port of Oakland, to really be much more cost-effective in the use of every dollar that we have. 2 years ago at the Decision Makers Conference, we actually had a very interesting panel where we asked our regulatory partners what efforts they were making in their agencies to look at jobs creation and cost effectiveness. I think that particular metric for us still applies. We really want to be aligned with our regulatory partners in terms of cost effectiveness of all dollars. I have a suggestion here as well, and that is something that we've been learning in terms of partnering, and that is to have an opportunity, and perhaps the forum that Joe talked about in December will be an opportunity for this, for us to really bring together our strategic plans and our capital programs and look at points of connection. What I've learned in my work as the Director of Programs and Planning at the Port of Oakland is that frequently agencies independently develop their strategic plans or their plans of action, but then they come to the regulatory agencies and they want buy-in. What we really need to do is we need to look at the plans concurrently and find the points of connection, because we might be missing opportunities, or we simply might be moving in different directions. Finally, I'd like to raise an issue that I don't think we've really talked about today in terms of beneficial reuse, and also an issue that is beginning to face all of the ports and where I think dredging will have a major role, and that is in the area of sea level rise. A couple of years ago, not too long ago, we had a very interesting visit from the Consul General of the Netherlands. Some of you may know that the Netherlands just moved its consulate from Southern California to Northern California. And one of the reasons is that at least was given to us was they want to be very close to Silicon Valley. They see Silicon Valley as a major area for them to be engaged with. But they also were very, very interested in the issue of sea level rise, which you know in the Bay Area has really been put on the radar. And they feel as a country they have a lot of expertise to offer to the Bay Area because of their hundreds of years, not thousands of years, of dealing with rising sea levels. So they thought, well, perhaps there's a market here for their engineering companies and their construction companies. We actually, at the Port of Oakland, we thought there was an interest as well in developing, we want to develop flights to Amsterdam. We actually now have a charter flight again to Amsterdam through Oakland International. So we were trying to encourage business development on that side. But the point is, after we had this wonderful discussion about business development and engineering and sea level rise, we took the Dutch team out to Middle Harbor to show them the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park. And it was low tide at the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, and when you go to low tide at the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, you see that vast expanse of mudflats that extend to the dike that was built at the Federal Channel as part of our dredging project. And the Consul General looked at me and he said, wow, you did this? I said, well, we said, yeah, the Port of Oakland did this, you know, as a shallow water habitat, use of beneficial use of dredge materials. He said, this was precisely what we were going to pitch to you that you should be doing here. The reason is that these shallow water areas that are subject to tidal flow are very effective buffers, natural buffers that have obviously many, many ecological benefits as well to our developed areas. And this is something I think that we as a community here in the Bay Area really need to be thinking about as a win-win use of dredge materials, perhaps a way of lowering the cost of raising the height of our levees, and also protecting our developed areas against the potential effects of sea level rise. So with that, I will stop. We will have obviously opportunities for Q&A, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Richard. We've got a lot of good questions here that we're not going to have enough time for. I don't want to. I'm sure Eris would like us to go through all of them and then send everybody home. But we are going to get to Eris. So I'm going to ask two questions, or read two questions. One for our core panelists, including Joe, if he's willing to possibly respond to this question, and then a question for our port presenter, Richard. There was mention by Mr. Saperstein, let me find the question here, about innovative funding, and in looking forward to improving the planning process and getting, projects under construction. How do you think these funding methods can be improved and to get you to the front of the line faster and get the projects under construction? Anybody want to try that one?
Just one thought. We already have MOUs with the Nature Conservancy and other nonprofits, I think in the Northwest. And so this sort of collaboration with Trout Unlimited is essential to modern planning. Collaborate rather than litigate. And some of these people can bring funds to the table. So these are the sorts of dialogues we're engaging in. And we have projects that we've undertaken with Nature Conservancy and others.
Any other innovative funding things that CORE's working on?
I would just say when you say innovative funding, it's a big universe of tools. Let's call it that, tools in the box. So that's one of them. You know, then there's this set of conventional approaches where we have contributed funds, advanced funding, and accelerated funding, right? And that's where we have agreements where sponsors do have dollars in hand that may be ready ahead of time or in advance of a project, or perhaps they want betterment on a project and they just want to put more money in the project. So that's that tier of advanced, contributed, and accelerated. And then there's the third tier, which is the unknown frontier, which is kind of the one I'm interested in, which is packaging cash flows from the projects, from moving water, from storing water, from providing reliable water, and raising private debt, maybe in the bond markets. And that would work in places where we could perhaps tie in flood control to water supply. Now that's a big leap. I said that to some folks back in Washington about 4 months ago, and they said, "Boy, have you really, bit off a big one." But I think the sell to this, and this is what I would tell the OMBs and the antagonists against that, are, look, we're not getting into the water supply business. What we're doing is we're using water supply to help capitalize flood control and water storage. And instead of you, OMB, having to write a check for 65% of the share in a flood control project, come along with me, help me do a water supply hybrid deal, and maybe it's only 35%. And the other 35% comes from the sponsor, and the other 35% comes from Wall Street. And so that's kind of the hook, you know, and ladder on that one. And I'm just now getting started. I fingered 2 guinea pigs, not in this region, to try to push the framework together for looking at a pilot where we're actually tying in a flood control structure into reclaimed water and recycled water that's used for industrial operations. I figured I'd pick on guys with deep pockets, Mobil, Exxon, and Shell, so that they can't cry about Farmer Joe. And so they'll pay a loaded rate at the end of the day for their water that gives them a predictable, reliable cost over the next 10 years. Wall Street likes that. The rating agencies like that. It has nice inflated curves over the 10-year period. And maybe we can go raise some private capital and use that to augment. And then I don't have to stand in line for Congress for that money. I can just take bond financing, at least for the front end. And then when the appropriation finally shows up, that's the back end of the pie. So innovative financing has a lot of, you know, the Fed-to-Fed kind of interagency thing is inside of your speech. It's a lot easier to move money between federal agencies than it is between non-federal sponsors and us.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Joe. And the last question then for Richard Sinkoff is, in his experience with the Port of Oakland Deepening or other projects that the Port of Oakland is planning for the future, what do you think are the single biggest challenge that could possibly kill a project or delay it beyond its feasibility stage?
Well, that's a really tough one. So the question is, what is the single biggest problem that can kill a good project? So on the spot, I would say a lack of flexibility is probably the big, you know, you can generalize. Right now we're facing major problems in terms of funding, right? So if the LTMS is saying that the long-term management strategy is saying there's a certain disposition of material that has to go upland as opposed to the ocean, and we're finding that the costs of just that protocol are too prohibitive, what we need is flexibility. We need to be able to look at alternatives in a manner that's reasonable. So certainly right now, cost is a major problem. It's an issue that's practical. What we need is flexibility. There has to be a way to achieve the same goals by looking at a different pathway. So I would put that out there.
Good answer. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank all the panelists.